along the lines of independent politics was that on a national level, there seem to be several efforts underway at the present time. There's the Labor Party advocates. The Greens seem to be moving somewhat in that direction. The Now is discussing independent politics, and Ron Daniels is undertaking what quite possibly may be an independent campaign. Do you see those coming together? How do you see those in relationship to your effort and relationship to each other?
Let me tell you that I think one of the reasons that we have been successful in Vermont, and I regard this as a pretty good prescription for the rest of the country, is that what's most important is to pay attention to your own constituencies and bang away. Now, I think what will eventually happen if we are successful in developing independent political movements around the country is there will be a coming together of them. What concerns me is that 12 people coming together to decide they've started a national party. You got to start with some grassroots composition. So it is very exciting to me to see that the United Electrical Workers is now coming out for the concept of a third party. Tony Mazzocchi, as you've indicated, has long been an advocate of a third party. I was delighted, as I mentioned in my remarks, that in Texas the AFL-CIO now is saying we're not automatically married to the Democratic Party. We're looking at the possibility of running independent candidates. I think that the disgust with the two-party system is such that you're going to see in the not too distant future a mushrooming of that type of activity. So it is true that some of the environmentalists and the green movement are looking at that, and we got a call from people out on the West Coast, I can't remember where, maybe from Oregon, who are interested in that. So I think at this point, rather than, I guess in my state what we're doing is we have been doing it for 20 years, and we're probably far ahead of the rest of the country. And we are coming very close to bring together a marriage of the unions, women's movement, the peace movement, environmental movement. So what I would say is that people should concentrate on their own constituencies now, build up the grassroots, and in a couple of years, let's come together.
Okay. In light of the current effort to obtain anti-scab legislation, do you see any long-range possibility of repealing repressive laws against labor, such as the Taft-Hartley Act?
Well, that's a desirable goal. At this point, as you know, it's not likely that we're going to even succeed in doing the rather easy and conservative thing of making sure that workers can retain their jobs after they go out on strike. So what you're saying is, if you're suggesting as a long-term labor agenda, that we want to create a workers' bill of rights. We want to raise the minimum wage. We want to give workers some input and decision-making in the industries that they work. We want a new industrial policy with significant worker input. That's the goal. But the real story of this anti-worker replacement fight in Congress right now is that we don't know if we'll be able to win victory in the Senate, and we don't know if we'll be able to sustain, override a presidential veto. So to talk about repealing Taft-Hartley is a little bit down the road when we can't pass some very easy and basic labor rights legislation.
Okay. What can citizens at the grassroots do, at the grassroots level, to take an effective action to begin dismantling the military apparatus? How do you challenge that?
You see, my answer to that question is similar to my answer to the first question. Nothing is going to change. You're not going to have a third party. You're not going to have respect for the environment. You're not going to have equal rights for women. You're not going to reduce, to answer your question, military spending. Now, I have proposed legislation which would lower military spending in this country by 50% over a 5-year period. I don't think that's terribly radical. The Cold War is over. You don't need to be spending $300 billion a year fighting against, second-rate military nations. But you're not going to bring that about unless there is a mass movement of people. And what I am not sympathetic to is simply people saying, okay, I'm concerned about high military spending. Well, I'm concerned about tax reform. I'm concerned about women's issues. I'm concerned about the environment. I'm concerned about labor movement and workers' rights. You see, we've been doing that single issue stuff for many, many years. And the end result is you have a president who is anti-worker, anti-women's rights, anti the environment, supports much too large military budgets. What you're fighting for politically is for power. And what we've got to do is bring together all of these divergent groups into a political movement. And what each group has got to understand, they may not get 100% of what they want. But basically, we are on the same side in calling for radical change of national priorities, in trying to have a government represent the vast majority of the people and not just the wealthy and the powerful. That's what we've got to do. So to answer your question, I think we can lower military spending, but you're not going to do it until tens of millions of people come together and demand change in national priorities. Tell politicians they're going to throw them out unless they vote for reducing the military budget. But you can't do that unless you have a political movement. So that's a long answer to a short question.
Okay. With the breakup of the Soviet Union, okay, you've already said that, movement in Congress to cut bloated war expenditures. Then I guess just as a side point to that, you would say that Congressman Aspen's call for a $1 million shift in money from the military budget to peacetime aid to the $1 billion. Yes, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Is pretty lame.
$1 billion?
$1 billion from the defense budget to the.
When did Aspen come out with this recently?
It was just this morning on the Today Show.
No, that's nothing. That's ridiculous. $1 billion is nothing. What you're talking about now is the Republican Party coming up with a budget of something like, if my memory is correct, $289.7 billion. And the Democrats with a military budget of 289.6. Okay, both parties came up with that number because 290 was the maximum that you can come forward with under the Budget Reconciliation Act of 1990. What really has got to happen in Congress is that we must break that Budget Reconciliation Agreement, because that agreement stipulated quite clearly that if you lowered military spending, you could not use that money for domestic purposes or even to deal with it. You just couldn't use it for education or for desperately needed social programs. In fact, Congressman Ted Weiss and a number of us are working on legislation which would break that agreement, which would say, yeah, let's start the process of lowering military spending and using that money for domestic purposes. That's the real fight. If Aspen is talking about $1 billion reduction, that's ridiculous. I mean, first of all, $290 billion is too much under any circumstances. Given the end of the Cold War, given the disintegration of the Soviet Union, given the fact that you have 5 million children who are hungry in the United States today, you get 2 million people sleeping out on the street, you have millions of kids who can't afford to go to college, that you have desperate need for monies to go into energy conservation, into environmental protection. The needs facing this nation are enormous. And the basic issue that the American people are going to have to ask yourselves is, do you want to continue to spend more and more money on a bloated military budget, or do you want to start addressing the enormous domestic problems facing this country? So I'm not sympathetic to Aspen's $1 billion request. That's silly. We should be talking about, I think it's conservative to talk about cutting the budget by 50% over a 5-year period. So that would be, something like $145 billion over a 5-year period.
Thank you. 2 more questions. Now that the Cold War is over, the CIA kind of seems to be about as useless as the KGB. Even beyond getting rid of all the apparatus of the military, we seem to have no rationale left for the security apparatus, the spies. Are there any efforts being discussed to abolish this or severely downgrade it? That's
a very good question. And you see, I don't think the media gave it much coverage. I don't know if you got any coverage of it. And here in Vermont, you got no coverage of it. I think it was about 2 months ago, the United States Congress voted to approve the intelligence budget for the intelligence community. The newspapers reported that the intelligence community, that includes the CIA and the other DIA and the others, were receiving about $30 billion a year. there were, if my memory is correct, 4 members of the United States Congress who did not vote for that $30 billion appropriation for precisely the reasons that you're giving. You got hungry children, you got homelessness, you got educational crisis. Why are we spending so much money for intelligence work and for counterinsurgency work when the Soviet Union is in the midst of disintegration? We should be sharply cutting that budget. That's why I and 3 other members of Congress did not vote for that budget. But you might ask, what happened to the other 430 members and the members of the United States Senate? I mean, that's why you need a new political party. That's a very good question.
Let me guess. Dellums, Conyers, and Major Owens.
Actually, I think not. It was Gus Savage, myself, Maxine Waters, and I can't remember who the 4th was.
Finally, this goes to the heart of the whole question of the validity of the two-party system. There's a large body of evidence indicating that the Republicans conspired with Iranian terrorists to hold the hostages in Tehran in 1980, thus thwarting President Carter's efforts to have them released. Given the fact that the Democrats may have had the 1980 election in some sense subverted from their cause by that effort, what do you make of their reluctance, since they control Congress and the House of Representatives, the Judiciary Committee, their reluctance to mount an effective congressional investigation of that scandal?
I mean, I think that might have been a valid question a little while ago. To the best of my knowledge, Foley has now finally, after a period of time, announced that there will be a thorough investigation. My guess is, and I applaud that. You're right. People have been talking about this issue for 10 years now, and it's been in the left press for many, many years. It was finally picked up by the New York Times, I guess, with Gary Sick's article, that op-ed piece, which then started to mushroom around the establishment media. I think, what I can simply tell you is people have been talking about it. There appears to be some evidence, and I think the investigation is proper because you want to finally deal with this issue. Is it true? Is it not true? If it is true, it is a very, very serious development with regarding the President of the United States. If it's not true, then let's not talk about it anymore and absolve Bush of any responsibility. But you need the investigation, and you need all the evidence to come out. You need Bush to give all the all the opportunity to give his point of view, and then you reach a conclusion. I would agree with you that the Democratic leadership took a long time coming to the conclusion that they wanted an investigation. A letter went around Congress, which I signed, urging them to do it, and they really did drag their feet. But I think the decision has been made. I think their reluctance probably, and God knows I don't want to speak for Mr. Foley, was probably the feeling that the American people might perceive this as a witch hunt on the president. And if it were a witch hunt, it would be totally improper. You don't hold investigations on making very serious charges unless you have the evidence. But I think the decision has been made to have the investigation. I think that's great. I think it's proper. Let all the information come out. We will then form a conclusion.
Could I just one more?
Sure.
Since coming to Congress, you're on banking and finance. Is your main committee assignment?
And government operations.
Government operations. All right. You've taken the step of, since you are an independent and you're the only independent in Congress, you have worked with the Democrats on organizational questions. Essentially, you've voted with them on the question of organizing the House, who the Speaker will be, and so forth. You see that then as a marriage of convenience dictated by the political circumstances of the moment, and I suppose if you could get maybe 50 or 100 more independents in there, it would be a different ball game. Would you care to comment on that?
Well, I think you stated it quite well. In order to function effectively in Congress, you need to be on a committee. In fact, it had been my intention to remain as an independent and to function within the Democratic caucus. It turned out that that did not work out. There are many people who refused to have me in the Democratic caucus, but what we ended up doing is reaching what I thought was a pretty good compromise with the Democratic leadership, and they said, okay, you're not going to come into the caucus, but we will treat you as, in fact, for committee assignment purposes, as in fact, if you, like you were a Democrat. So I got exactly the committees I wanted, by the way, banking and government operations. So I ended up doing better than many of the freshmen. And it is a marriage of convenience. That's the only game in town in terms of committee assignments. They are the people who make those decisions. So, and also it's true that, you know, more often, almost always, if the choice comes down between the Democratic position and the Republican position, not always, but almost always, I vote for the Democratic position, and certainly supported Foley over Bob Michael for Speaker. Okay.
Fred, finished?
I guess I just, you made some comments about the savings and loan scandal. Do you see that, do you see us ever getting that atrocious settlement reversed or righted?
What you have there is a very frightening scenario, and the fear that it is not necessarily going to end immediately. What you're looking at now is a request by the President for another $80 billion on top of the $80 billion that has already been granted. There are those who say that the additional $80 billion is not going to be enough and that you may need another $120 billion. Now, when you understand that this money is simply dumped into the deficit and that to cover it, money is borrowed over a 30 or 40-year period, you're looking at a total payback of whatever it may be, $600, $700, $800 billion over a 30-year period that our kids and literally grandchildren are going to be paying for. Now, you got a couple of issues here. Number one, in terms of the payback, how should you proceed? My feeling, as I indicated to the membership here, is that at a time when the richest 1% have seen a doubling of their income in the last 10 years and are paying less in taxes, obviously they should be asked to pay a significant part of that back. Second of all, that is the group, by and large, that benefited from the junk bonds, that took advantage of the high interest rates that these banks were offering. So I think to ask working people who had nothing to do with this, really, did not make any money out of it, basically to pick up the burden, or to ask elderly people to suffer cutbacks in Medicare, because when you put all that money in the deficit, the corollary of that is that the President then says, gee, we have a terrible deficit. We've got to cut, as they did last time, was it $43 billion in Medicare? They've got to cut back on veterans programs, got to cut back on all kinds of desperate programs. So that's really what you're talking, that's what the S&L is. When you throw that money into the deficit, what you're really saying is to the elderly, to the poor, to the young, there's just going to be no money available for your programs because we're busy paying off the S&L stuff. Now, second point, you can go into an eight-hour discussion on this thing. What is interesting is you understand that this money is being used to pay back depositors. That's what it's being used. And when Nicholas Brady came before our committee, and the establishment line on this, it's a wonderful line, it says, well, the average payback, the average depositor is $10,000. Well, you know, a lot of people have $10,000 in the bank. You don't have to be very rich. And the line is, don't you think it's just fair? We have to pay these guys back. Well, the question was asked, what percentage of the depositors receive what percentage of the payback? In other words, if I've got $1 million in the bank and you have $1 in the bank, on the average, we have $500,000. I'm a millionaire and you're broke, right? So figures often distort reality. My strong impression, I've not gotten this information yet, is the lion's share of the government money used for the bailout depositors went to the very rich and the people who had a lot of deposits. Big amounts of deposits. You follow what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Now, I'm sure that many small depositors also received their money from the government. But my guess is that what you see is a situation where the working people of America, through higher taxes, through cuts in programs, will be bailing out the very wealthy. I think another aspect of this thing, which is extremely disturbing and doesn't get a whole lot of attention, is we don't think very much about who caused the problem, how did it happen. And one of the reasons that you don't is that both political parties are up to their eyebrows in it. The S&L fiasco came about after Ronald Reagan for years and years was saying, We've got to get the government off the backs of business. We've got to deregulate, let business people go out and make money, and that's how the whole economy improves. Well, they got the government off the backs of the S&L people, and they turned out to be a pack of thieves. Approximately 1/3 of the banks that failed, the S&Ls that failed, were involved not just in stupid investment, that's bad, but not just being greedy, but in outright fraud. Okay, so you got, these guys ripping off the system right and left. Now, the other problem you have is that the Democrats, as you know, with the Keating Five, with Jim Wright, they were also involved in this stuff. So it's a marriage of convenience in that neither party really wants to get into it because they both share a significant part of the blame for this fiasco. So the immediate problem that we face is who the hell is going to pick up the payback. And I, along with other members of Congress, want to do what we can to make sure that it's not the working people or the elderly or the poor.
Inspired. I came here today to get inspired. When you and I don't know how many people tell you that. They come up to you afterwards and say you were very inspiring. And it seems to me that that's one of the things that's wrong with this country, is that very, very, very few politicians inspire. It seems like our national role models are Hollywood movie stars or football players or entertainers, and not union organizers or not politicians. What do you think of that?
I think there's truth to that. And the reason why that's so is quite complicated. But when you have an intellectually and morally corrupt political system with pretty tight lids on it, it doesn't allow for a lot of freedom for politicians to begin to get up and say the right thing. When you have a campaign financing situation where the rich contribute heavily to the candidates of their choice, and candidates that are trying to represent working people and poor people can't get the money, or you're tied into a political party which does not look favorably upon people speaking up. How do you run as a Democrat or Republican and not talk about the bankruptcy of your own political party? I mean, one of the funny things that happens in Congress is very often we hear mayors coming before us, and I'm a former mayor, so I know what they're talking about, and I'm sympathetic, and they say, the federal government has turned its backs on the cities and the towns, and then they document very carefully about, quite correctly, the significant reduction in federal aid for housing, for crime prevention, for drug rehabilitation, for homelessness, for all of these things, and they're right. And yet, what they cannot conclude is that their representatives, the people in their own party, are usually dominate both houses of Congress, is usually the case with the Democratic mayors, or if they're Republican mayors, they are the White House, they're the president. So they're caught in this bind about not being forthright in their critique. They can't go forward to the people at election time and say, I'm your Republican mayor, do not vote for George Bush because his policies are destroying cities in America. They can't say that, right? You can't do that, so you got to hedge on that. And then they go before the people and you wonder why they're not inspiring. Well, you would not be inspiring if you could not follow through on your analysis, right? You make the case, whose fault is it? Well, not quite the White House fault. Then the Democrats are in exactly the same bind. They control many of the cities in America. Can they come forward and say, hey, the Democrats in Congress have turned their backs on the cities? Now, the fact of the matter is, interestingly enough, that the situation is becoming so desperate that many mayors, Democratic mayors, are saying that precisely. They're beginning, just within the last couple of months, Ray Flynn of Boston and others are beginning to raise their voice, and they're not just yelling at the president anymore. They're saying, hey, let's be frank, the Democrats control the Congress. You're turning your backs on your constituency. Do something, stand up. So you're seeing some conflict arise there. But I think that's the reason that politicians can't be inspiring, because the system is pretty tight. If you stand up and say the wrong thing, you're going to get in trouble. If you're in the House of Representatives and you say the right thing, do you think that a member of the House Ways and Means Committee is going to get up there and say, that Dan Rostenkowski, damn it, why doesn't he come out for progressive taxes? Well, you say that. I would say there's probably a good chance your future on the House Ways and Means Committee may not be all that secure. That's the way the system works, okay? You going to stand up and attack Speaker Foley? Not very likely. If you're a Republican, you're going to stand up and be sharp about your criticism of the President of the United States? Maybe. Not too likely. So that's basically the problem. Also, I think what you have is radio and television. What is very sad is that I would say the vast majority of young people in this country have never heard a political speech in their lives. They've never heard a speech. They've never heard a political person try to develop a series of thoughts beyond 30 seconds. How often, if you turn on the television, do you hear any political speeches? Well, you may on C-SPAN, for example. They will carry it. C-SPAN does an excellent job. And their viewing audience is growing, as a matter of fact. But if you don't have cable, if you watch the networks, you will never see that. You will never hear, no matter what political point of view that person has. So what then happens is that politics, for a lot of reasons, becomes entertainment. And that's why Ronald Reagan was such a successful president, because politics became a 6-second soundbite. If Reagan had to give an hour speech or was asked by a serious media person to deliver a thoughtful commentary on a major problem, he would be exposed for not knowing anything about what's going on. But the great mystery of the Reagan era is that for 8 years, the system managed to protect Reagan and allow him to give his 6-second sound bites. The media allowed them to get away with that. So that's, again, a long answer to a short question.
It's a pretty serious, searing indictment of the mass media, and I wholeheartedly agree with you. I think that there's probably no institution in this country that has done a better job of destroying democracy and and supporting the capitalist consume more society than the mass media. And I'm just curious as to how the mass media treated your campaign in Vermont.
Well, I mean, I think what everybody understands is that the media, the mass media in America is clearly corporately controlled. I mean, that's not a debatable issue. General Electric owns NBC, and other banks and corporations own ABC and CBS. And nobody would argue, the president of NBC would not argue, that the function of NBC and the other corporations is not to provide information and not to present serious debate, discussion, not to educate and inform. That's not its function. Its function is to make money. And I understand actually that GE is not making enough money with NBC, and I guess they're thinking of selling it. And that's a problem. And what we also know is that the media is owned by fewer and fewer large corporations. So corporate control over the media is being concentrated in fewer and fewer large companies. And I think that is a very dangerous trend. You know, it's funny how people say, quite correctly, that we don't want the government controlling the media. I share that view. I mean, you don't want to have a Soviet, what was in the past, the Soviet-style media, where television every night told you how great job the government was doing, right? You don't want that. And yet people keep saying, we don't want that, and then they forget to look at the other side, which is you don't want General Electric. You don't want the banks and the major corporations to also be telling you what's going on in the world. The conflict of interest is so very obvious that we didn't get into it in any great detail. The other thing of concern is not only does the corporately controlled media prevent alternative points of view from coming across. Right, here are all these problems facing America. They are not being discussed on television to any significant degree. Television does not allow serious debate of the issues. I mean, even in many of the industrialized nations, time is allocated to political parties where you have debates, not just at election time, but serious debates on a weekly basis. Increasingly, television, especially television and radio, politics is seen as entertainment, and that's precisely why entertainers become good politicians. What is important is who wins, the horse races, this guy gonna win, or that guy, what's the latest poll showing, what's the gossip, did Chuck Robb really have sex with Miss Virginia, or was it just a back massage, etc., etc., rather than educating people and debating the important issues facing the nation. So that's the scandal. The scandal is you have How do you reindustrialize America and provide decent jobs for our people in an environmentally sound way? What does the president think of that? I think if somebody asked the president that, he'd fall off his platform. No one ever asked him that question. And if people demanded that he give more than a 6-second answer, that would also be quite incredible. So what we need to do, and you're not going to have it under the present political system, you need a media which has a responsibility to the American people to educate, to inform, to allow serious dialogue, to allow a wide range of views to be presented in terms of film and so forth and so on. Now, as it happens, I am going to be holding a series of hearings in my own state, the state of Vermont, to get people's ideas on this issue. And out of those hearings will come legislation. Certainly, one of the things that we want to do, and this I'm quite firm about, is you want to have full public funding for public television. Clearly, it is no secret that the PBS, which does allow for more debate than the commercial networks, is also, because of its financial straits, increasingly dominated by corporate interest and the oil companies, because those are the people, the institutions they go to for their funding. If the federal government cuts funding, who are you going to go to for funding? So you go to the stock market, you go to the GEs of the world for funding, and that's why if you look at the nature of programming on PBS, Jeff Cohn of FAIR has done a whole lot of excellent work on this. And what he points out is you got you got the Wall Street in Review, you have Bill Buckley, you have McLaughlin, you have the whole National Review, extreme right-wing crowd on program after program. Now, how many programs on the PBS are run from a progressive point of view? Where is Labor Week in Review? It doesn't exist. And you know why it doesn't exist? It's not even a conspiracy. We shouldn't get into conspiracy theory here. The reason is it costs a lot of money to produce these programs. And if the United Electrical Workers could come up with a few $1 million to give to PBS to produce a labor show, my guess is that PBS would put it on. They would put it on. But what they have to get is a few $1 million. Now, where does this money come from? Obviously, corporate America is interested in sponsoring those programs which are sympathetic to its point of view. So that's why you have the Wall Street Week in Review and Wall Street, whatever it's called. And you have a whole bunch of programs from the right, and you have virtually no programming from the left, because it's very hard to get, by definition, corporate sponsor or big money sponsor for a progressive show. So we need to have public television, publicly funded, so the people who run that really can be objective, provide a wide range of discussion, and not have to worry about antagonizing the corporate sponsorship. Very important. In terms of commercial television, we really have to have a debate in this country as to what is the proper responsibility of the owners of commercial television to the people. You know that in Western Europe and in Sweden, just as an example, violence on children's television is not allowed in Sweden. They made a decision, and I don't know how many other European countries, I have the feeling Sweden is not alone, that violence is not a healthy thing for kids to be absorbing day after day on cartoons and so forth. They've eliminated it. Television in Europe will have advertisements, far fewer, smaller amount of time for commercials. Some of the commercials may be actually pushed to a certain point of time, so you could watch programming without being interrupted every 12 seconds. They will have more public types of programming in the sense of dealing with the issues facing the nations. Right now, what we have done, especially under Reagan and Bush, is to give the owners of the networks a carte blanche to do anything they want to make money, and the public be absolutely damned. So the result of that is you have an extraordinarily low level of television. You have violence, you do not have serious debate, and the Congress doesn't do anything. So we'll be holding hearings in my own state on this issue, and out of that will come some legislation to attempt to address that issue.